This is the story of Orson Welles.
That was Orson Welles.
Orson Welles?
Orson Welles.
Orson Welles.
The Wonder Kid filmmaker who in 1941 made his first motion picture at the age of 25. A film that you've probably heard of. Helmed by many to be one of, if not the greatest film of all time. And how his next film was said by preview audiences and Welles himself to be his true masterpiece. All before the original film ceased to exist, with it being embroiled in controversies involving the film studio, the US government, and the Second World War.
It's, I think, the greatest artistic tragedy that particular film was so mutilated.
Hot off the success of his theatre and radio productions, 23-year-old Orson Welles had gained major publicity and interest from Hollywood. This came after his radio drama of War of the Worlds, which made the headlines as it had listeners convinced of a real alien invasion during its broadcasting. Though many in Hollywood were interested in Welles, it was RKO Pictures who were the most desperate, as they found themselves in a creative and financial turmoil and in need of a change. So, in an attempt to convince Welles into making motion pictures for the studio, the head of RKO, George Schaefer, offered the now 24-year-old an unprecedented contract, one that he couldn't refuse, which to this day remains the most lucrative deal ever made for a filmmaker in Hollywood. The contract granted Welles the ability to act, direct, produce, and write 3 motion pictures of his choice with complete artistic control, on 2 conditions. The films could not exceed their given budget, and RKO had to greenlight the story beforehand. RKO couldn't cut any parts of the film they didn't like, or change the cast and crew for personnel more favourable. They couldn't even see the film's footage unless Welles decided to show them. But what was most unprecedented was the fact that RKO gave Orson Welles, a 24-year-old who at this point had never even stepped on the film set, the right to the final cut. Welles would then spend the next 5 months trying to write an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, which would eventually be scrapped due to Welles' inability at staying within the budget restraints, which were becoming even stricter with the Second World War fast approaching. Though Heart of Darkness led Welles to a dead end in production, it would go on to give way to his next venture, Citizen Kane, which in modern times is regarded as one of the greatest and most influential pieces of cinema ever made, but that wasn't the view in 1941. At release, the publicity around the film had nothing to do with Welles' technical achievements or Greg Toland's innovative cinematography. Instead, the focus was on William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon who found himself as the source of inspiration for the character of Charles Foster Kane, and, as you can imagine, he wasn't best pleased to find out. After one of his journalists caught a preview of the film, his paper launched an attack on Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, with front-page stories, lawsuits, and even offering to buy the film of RKO, all in an attempt to prevent a wide release. Out of fear of being sued or becoming the victim of a defamatory story, cinemas were scared to screen the film, so RKO had no choice but to delay the film's release, and subsequently vault the film, sealing Citizen Kane's fate as a commercial failure, and a failure which would destroy Welles' relationship with RKO, and ultimately destroy his career in Hollywood.
Do you ever get over something like that?
Not really. You don't. You don't.
For Welles' second project, he wanted to do something special. RKO wanted adaptations of books such as The Way to Santiago or Journey into Fear, but Welles eventually fell upon Booth Tarkington's 1918 novel The Magnificent Ambersons, which told the story of a wealthy Midwestern family and their eventual downfall. In many ways, a similar film to Citizen Kane. However, with Ambersons, Welles was going for something far more somber and unforgiving in its tone. It seemed to be the perfect fit for Welles. It was a story he loved, one that he had already adapted back in his radio days, but for all that The Magnificent Ambersons could have been, it was ultimately doomed from the start. In order for Welles to convince RKO to make his next project, he had to renegotiate the contract which allowed him the freedom to make his first. Still believing he'd be in control of his film, Welles agreed to the contract that would revoke his right to the final cut, giving the power back to the studio. It was also around this time that Nelson Rockefeller, the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, as well as the principal stockholder in RKO Pictures, appointed Welles as a goodwill ambassador to Latin America, in an attempt to counter the growing influence of the Axis powers and Hitler's fascist regime. So, in January 1942, after 4 months of production, Welles finishes shooting Ambersons and begins post-production, 2 weeks behind schedule and exceeding the given budget by $200,000. He is then flown to Washington, D.C. for a briefing about his next film, a film that would be unlike anything he had made before. He had been asked by the Brazilian government to produce a documentary of the annual Rio Carnival that was to take place in the following month. Before leaving for Brazil, Welles and editor Robert Wise rushed to put together a rough cut of Ambersons, which came out at a runtime of around 135 minutes. The plan was for Wise to accompany Welles to Brazil so they could work together whilst editing Ambersons, but due to wartime restrictions on travel, Wise had to stay in America, meaning that Welles was left to edit his film from another country, thousands of miles away, only being able to communicate via the telephone and cable, whilst at the same time filming a documentary in service of the US government during a Second World War. Wanting to release Ambersons as soon as possible, studio head George Schaefer requested a private screening of the 135-minute rough cut for himself and a fellow RKO executive named Charles Kerner, who, like many in Hollywood at the time, had a strong hatred for Orson Welles. Worried about the film's length, Schaefer ordered a subsequent screening for a small audience, with Ambersons playing second in a double feature with a Betty Hutton musical.
Hey there, mister, you better hide your sister, 'cause the fleet's in.
Which is about as big a clash of tones as you can get, and as you can imagine, it didn't bode well for Welles's picture. The screening was a disaster. Out of the 113 comments made by the audience, 61 of them came back negative, with most of the comments criticising the unhopeful nature of the film, stating that there was, quote, too much gloom, or that it was too morose, or a personal favourite of mine was that there were too many weird camera shots. With George Schaefer and RKO under pressure and becoming more and more frustrated with Ambersons, the communication with Welles became bitter, with RKO requesting for Welles to recut and reshoot scenes, only for him to refuse, insisting that the film should be released his way or not at all. In the end though, neither of those things happened. After no longer having the right to the final cut, Welles was left powerless. RKO would undergo major changes in management, with Welles's biggest supporters, Schaefer and Rockefeller, both leaving the company, placing Charles Kerner in charge, the executive who all the while had been behind the scenes pushing to dismantle Welles's career and film, and he would go on to do exactly that. RKO decided to recut and reshoot multiple scenes, including the final one, replacing Welles's desired melancholic ending with one that was more upbeat, as well as cutting the film's 135-minute length to a staggering 88 minutes. And to top it all off, RKO completely cut ties with Welles and his team, ripping up his contract, meaning that not only did Welles lose creative control of Ambersons, but also his Carnival documentary had also been suspended, never to be finished. But what makes this story even more tragic is that RKO held a second preview screening of Ambersons shortly after the first, where RKO refused to listen to the 67 positive comments made out of a total of 85, where an overwhelming amount of the audience stated how the 135-minute version of The Magnificent Ambersons was not only as good or better than Citizen Kane, but also one of the finest pictures they had ever seen. What remains of The Magnificent Ambersons, much like the story Welles was telling, is merely the remains of greatness, with Welles's intended vision for the film nowhere to be seen. Where there was once a film full of inventive and spellbinding cinematography made by a filmmaker at the top of his game, is now a mutilated ruin full of segments altered or added by the studio that stick out thematically and are at times incomprehensible in terms of plot and in terms of the scene's physical geography. But the final nail in the coffin, the thing that really completed RKO's massacre of The Magnificent Ambersons, was the fact that the 45 minutes worth of original negatives that had been cut from the film had been destroyed to free up storage space. And to this day, people are still searching for the original rough cut of the film, but so far to no success, meaning that the last words spoken in The Magnificent Ambersons remain as cinema's most devastating yet.
I wrote the script and directed it. My name is Orson Welles. This is a Mercury production.
Have a good one.
The fleet's in. Hey.